The screams of the victims could still be heard on the nearby streets. The most favoured method of torturing was to hoist a victim into the air upside down and beat the soles of their feet until it was impossible for them to walk. And after a few days of such inhumane cruelty, men and women were prepared to admit just about anything. This device was used to torture several prisoners at once, strung like a washing line across the victims and used until they confessed to whatever they were accused of. 3 of Zakaria Alanjani's aunts and 4 of his uncles were tortured by state security. His grandfather was killed by them. He still doesn't know why.
We don't want Gaddafi dead. We want him alive. We want to know where our families are buried, why he killed them and who gave him that right.
That's what many want. Benghazi has suffered before at the hands of Gaddafi's state security. 1,200 civilians were killed in 1996 after a failed rebellion against autocratic rule. Bodies disappeared. Few details were known until now. Khadija Sakhli's 27-year-old son Yusuf was shot and arrested 15 years ago. He was never seen again. Last year, the family was given a certificate stating he was dead, but no explanation.
I haven't seen him since he got shot in our house. They took him to Tripoli. We went to get him, but they said he wasn't there.
The prisons and torture cells of liberated Libya now stand empty, their gruesome secrets of cruelty and inhumanity now open to the world. A sad indictment of a leader who long ago lost the love and respect of his people. Tony Bertley, AlJazeera, Benghazi.
Reports say Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is considering pursuing an interim peace agreement with the Palestinians. The reports say the deal would include a Palestinian state with temporary borders, marking a change in Israeli strategy. Well, let's speak more about this now to Moeen Rabbani, a senior fellow at the Institute of Palestinian Studies and a former analyst with the International Crisis Group. Thank you very much for speaking to us, Moeen. Why do you think the change in strategy from Israel now? Do you think it has anything to do with the anti-government protests going on right now in the Arab world?
Well, it's not a change in strategy. What we've seen is that since the Oslo agreements were signed in the early 1990s, Israel has essentially used diplomacy as a cover to legitimize its increasing expansion into the occupied territories on the ground. What we've had in the last few months is not only the anti-government protests throughout the region, as you mentioned, but with the collapse of this particular round of diplomacy on account of the U.S. veto in the Security Council, more and more questions are being raised about Israel's settlement activities in the occupied territories. So the real strategy here is not diplomacy, nor the objective of a temporary Palestinian state, which has been rejected by the Palestinians since it was first floated almost a decade ago. The real issue is to get diplomacy back on track,
right,
in order to allow it to continue to serve as a cover for settlement expansion on the ground in the occupied territories.
And indeed, we are hearing that the Middle East Quartet is in Israel trying to perhaps resume the stalled peace talks here. Do you think the climate is more conducive today for a resumption of negotiations?
Well, it depends what the negotiations are about. It seems that the quartet, somehow still under the spell of Tony Blair, is probably going to go along with this Israeli agenda. The good news is that because of these popular anti-government protests throughout the region, it may well be that the Palestinian leadership's hands are tied and it won't be able to go along with this Israeli agenda. So we'll have to see. But once again, I think the key point to note is that this is not about diplomacy. This is not about resolving the conflict. This is about finding one more pretext for settlement expansion in the occupied territories.
So do you think then that the Israeli Prime Minister isn't reconsidering his stance on the settlement freeze?
No, of course not. And a settlement freeze is nowhere on the agenda as far as Israel is concerned. In fact, you know, that's why the diplomatic process collapsed to begin with. And that's, you know, but Netanyahu saw that he narrowly escaped censure in the Security Council. It was only on account of the U.S. veto, and, you know, all 14 other members voted for censoring Israel. And he's probably worried that in the continued absence of diplomacy, people will begin to pay more and more attention to what Israel is actually doing on the ground, which is a story that really matters.
So what of plans, U.S. plans to reach a final status agreement within a year? Do you think that's unattainable?
There aren't any such plans anymore, and in fact the U.S. announces plans to reach a resolution of this conflict within a year, more or less once a year, and it's become a complete joke and charade. I mean, what we've seen with this administration is that it seems to be even more under the influence of Israeli priorities than any of its predecessors, particularly if you look at also the senior officials who were in charge of its policies on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think also these upheavals in the region will probably cause the Obama administration to put this conflict on the back burner on the grounds that they have more important things to worry about, like losing Egypt and other states in the region.
Okay, thank you very much, Muheen Rabat, for your analysis, joining us there live from Amman in Jordan. Thank you. Doctors in Haiti's capital say they have seen a significant easing in the number of cholera cases they are treating. In particular, they say fewer children are suffering from the waterborne disease. But poor living conditions mean sanitation remains a problem for hundreds of thousands left homeless after last year's devastating earthquake. The epidemic has killed some 4,500 people since it broke out in October. In Colombia, gunmen disguised in army uniforms have attacked a helicopter carrying the bank cash inside away with them. 4 policemen and 2 civilians were killed in the hit-and-run robbery. And it proves that guerrilla fighters still have the power to carry out high-profile attacks despite the heavy military crackdown in recent months. $105,000 have been stolen. At least 400 homes on the outskirts of the Bolivian capital, La Paz, have been destroyed in landslides and the floods that followed. The river Irpave is threatening to break its banks after nearly 60 million metric tons of mud fell into its path. 7 suburbs have already disappeared, and 3 more are disintegrating. Thanks for watching Al Jazeera. A reminder now of the stories making headlines. We are getting reports that pro-Gaddafi troops are storming towns and cities held by the opposition. Fighting is said to be taking place in Brega. Earlier we heard 2 other regions were retaken, but anti-government rebels say they have repelled some attacks. There have been more tough words, meanwhile, from the UN on Libya. The country's been thrown out of the Human Rights Council, an unprecedented move by the organization. Diplomats hope it will go some way to ending the crackdown on anti-government protesters. Well, Libya's troubles are continuing to cause headaches for its neighbors, in Tunisia in particular. Aid workers say the refugee situation at the border has reached crisis point. Dozens of stranded Egyptians have also been protesting about the slow pace of evacuations. And foreign diplomats are split on what kind of military options should be considered if the violence doesn't end soon. Some countries appear to be backtracking on the idea of imposing a no-fly zone over Libya. In other news, Pakistan's Minister of Minorities has been shot